And we're going to continue using the scene that we were working on previously, but we are going to make a few more adjustments and set a couple of things up first. I'm going to change our grid size just by using the right bracket key. Then we can zoom in a little. And what I want to do is first add in a collision object. And I'm going to call this collision underscore ground. And this is going to represent the ground for our scene. And we're going to set this up to group main. And the type is going to be a plane. And basically everything else we can leave around default. But I am going to be creating a new group a little bit later. But we're going to start out with just mainly the default settings. I'm going to change our mode to erase though. We're going to be using this to end our first particles and really affect how our second particle group is going to come in. So what I want to do is move down this plane so we're around at 0, because of course we do have a bit of an extension, and we can adjust that by using the radius or level, but I find it easier sometimes just to move that down rather than complicating anything by changing the settings, because sometimes by adjusting those different levels it can really affect the way we're working with the scene. Next thing I want to do is select our gravity, and what I want to do is increase the effect of this gravity so it happens a little bit quicker, and I'm going to reduce this value and change it to -3, and now we can see these particles coming down. Part of group main. We're going to go to our collision, make sure that's on group main, and we can take a look at how this is going to affect our different objects in the scene. And right now as I scrub through, we're really not noticing that is erasing our particles. So we may need to make some changes. I'm going to go ahead and change this to a box, increase the radius, and then move it down a little further. And we can still see that there are a couple of problems showing up. And some of that might be our second emitter that is showing. So what I'm also going to do is just change that back to the plane, because it is possible that is just that second emitter showing up, because of course it is still connected. So I'm going to select our child emitter, and right now we are connected to end. I'm going to change this to parent collision just for the time being. And now we can see that everything is showing up correctly, where we have our first set of particles being removed and erased from that collision object. So now we have a way of controlling how these different particles will end by using a collision. And I'm going to move down our object a little in our first emitter, and also change the generator size a little, because we're going to create a little bit of an animation with this a little bit later. I'm just going to bring this down to 5 meters, bring that Y back down to 0.5, and we can see that showing up and is affecting our birth rate a little. So maybe for right now I will change that back to 10, and we can scale that down later once we start changing the scene. So now we have a way of controlling when these particles end, and we're going to go into our emitter child. We're going to change that back to parent emitter end. So now once these end, our new particles will be created, and we can see that showing up, and they're just sort of coming out. It's a little bit of velocity but mainly they're slowing down, and we don't have a whole lot of particles showing up. And what I want to do is increase our birth rate so that we can see a lot more particles, since we are using the emitter end, which means we really need to increase that birth rate a lot more. So I'm going to bring that up to 100, and now we can see those all spanning out. But I want to create a little more realistic of an effect for if we had, for instance, maybe meteorites falling from the sky, and then when they hit the ground they explode, or maybe with bombs hitting, and then we could have new particles creating sort of the smoke or debris, and there's a lot we can do with that. So we need to make some modifications to the way that these particles are being generated and bounced back. Let's increase our birth rate up to 500, so we get a lot more particles from each of those ending ones. And what's happening right now is, of course, they're going below the collision and going down, and what we want is these particles to come back up. And there's a couple of different ways we can do this. One way is we could add another collision object to the scene, or we could use our existing one, Control-C to clone it, but I want to add in just a new collision, and we can take a look at one way of doing this. So we'll add in a new collision object, and I'm going to call this Ground Collide, and click OK. We want to change this to the child group, so we're affecting the second emitter. Change that to a plane, and we're going to have this mode set to bounce. And what I want to do is just put this directly below our emitter end and our erase, and we just want a little bit of a distance below that. And now if we take a look, once our particles hit the ground, they start to spread out. But of course that's with a new emitter. And this is very helpful for when you're working with hypervoxels, because if we want to have our first emitter, we'll take a look at emitter main, being one type of hypervoxel effect, and then when it hits the ground we want it to change, but we don't have to go into envelopes and really changing the scene a great deal. In order to achieve that, we can have new emitters created with new hypervoxel effects, and that'll also really help us with birth rate times and make it much easier to create different scenes. And we'll go ahead and apply some hypervoxels to that in just a sec so we can see that a little bit better. I am going to go into our gravity. I'm just going to close out this property panel and open up the object properties, select our gravity, and increase the rate, because we're working with a very long scene right now, and I do want to speed up this gravity so we can see it a little bit quicker and a little bit more going on throughout the animation. Bring that to -6, and now we can see that a lot better. So now if we want to adjust the way these particles are moving, we can go to our Ground Collide object, which is our new collision we added, and I want to increase our bounce bind power. Bring this up to 150, so that when we hit the ground it doesn't just spread out, but bounces. Now we can see that showing, but that may be a little bit too much. We can go ahead and increase that to 110, or decrease from 150 to 110. And now we just have that little bit of a bounce generating each of those objects. Now one thing to keep in mind is, since we are working with the emitter end, these particles are being created basically in frame mode. All of our particles are basically created at once. So once it hits that collision and the new particles are created, it is not a constant effect. It is not continually making new particles. Although there is a way we can create that effect, and we'll take a look at that in just a minute. We notice that these particles are not continually being generated. It creates a couple of them, and then it basically stops. And if we want to have them continually making particles and new generators constantly, there's a couple other things we need to do to change the scene to give that sort of an effect. But first, let's take a look at just some hypervoxels on these objects, and you can get a little bit of a better idea of the flexibility by using these different groups. So let's go ahead and hit Control F6, which is going to open up the Effects panel and the Volumetrics tab within there. And I'm going to add in Hypervoxels. Open up Viper, and I'm just going to reduce this to 320 by 240, so it's a little bit smaller. Double click on Hypervoxels, and I'm just going to readjust our panels so we can see the scene and also our Viper at the same time. But we also want to be able to control our timeline. So let's just move in a little bit into the scene so that we can see some of the first emitter and some of the second. In our Hypervoxels panel, we have emitter main and emitter child showing up. So we can double click on main, and now we can apply a Hypervoxels effect specifically to that main object. And basically our size right now is a little bit too large, where we have it at 1.3 meters, so I'm going to decrease that amount. And I want this to be a volume object. And we could either load in some presets or create our own. I'm going to start out with just using a preset, so we'll open up the preset shelf, which we can do over on the left, or we can hit F8 on the keyboard. And now I'm going to go to our fire and smoke, and we can select one of these fiery objects. I'll just select fire, and now it's going to ask if we'd like to keep the preset size, the particle size. I'm just going to click yes, which is going to change a couple of different options. And under advanced shading, I want to make sure our light is selected. Also want to go into our particle size and just make sure we can see some of these showing up. And right now it doesn't look like it's really matching with the scene, and that's because we're looking at this through our perspective view and not our camera view. So we want to make sure we change this all the way to frame 0, so we're not creating keyframes for our camera. We're going to go to our camera view, select our camera, hitting Control C, and then we can move and take a look at this using T for move and Y to rotate around. And now we can scrub through and see this a little bit better, and now we can see those objects showing up. Reduce our particle size, and I'm going to go into our shading and just increase the luminosity amount, which is also being controlled by a texture, which means the values of our gradient will need to be affected and changed. So in luminosity, we hit T to open up the texture editor for it, and we can select each of these different points, and what I want to do is just increase the value from 200% to 300, which will brighten it up a bit. Use texture. We'll go back to geometry, reduce our particle size to make them a little bit smaller. We could also use another preset for this. There's a couple of different options, of course, we can always use. You can scroll through the animation and take a look at these objects at different times within the scene. And now if I want, I could also increase the density amount, which will make them fill in a little bit more, a little bit brighter. I'm going to change this to the normal mode so we can really see what's going on. And if I increase this to 640 by 480, we can see these particles showing up a little bit better. I am going to change our lighting mode, and I did close out Viper. So I'm going to move that over to the right. And if we go to Advanced, our illumination is currently set to Rayleigh. If I set this to Constant, it's going to consistently light these objects a little bit differently. And we could end up with a little bit of a better looking effect. Go to Geometry, and just size these down a little bit. We can go to our Shading. And actually I'm going to decrease or increase the opacity amount to fill that in a little bit more. Density, thickness, just to make it a little bit brighter. And now we just have a little bit of hypervoxel on that first one. And of course, once they reach the point in the animation where they disappear, we're no longer going to see these hypervoxels. But we now have a new object in that child emitter that will allow us to create a new effect for those explosions on the bottom. So I'm going to select our emitter child and turn that on. And now we can see those new particles showing up. I'm going to go to our presets and just load in smoke. So now we have a smoke effect that is being added to those bottom particles. I'm going to change this to the scene preview mode, which is going to render and show us all of the particles within the scene. And now, of course, there aren't a lot of particles being created from our child, and we're not going to get the best looking smoke effects because of that. So we may need to increase the overall value and birth rate of those particles. But for right now, that should be alright. What I do want to do is go to our hypertexture for our emitter child. And I do want these to dissolve out over time. So instead of these particles and hypervoxels continually being rendered, I'm just going to add a little bit of a texture effect, which is going to be dissolve. And these will dissolve over time. And we could always change this to make it look a little bit better. I'll decrease our effect speed down to 50%. So we can see them a little bit longer. And of course there are better ways to dissolve out these effects, but for right now you should get a basic idea of how this is going to look. So now what I want to do is just render out a quick preview just within Viper. I'm going to reduce the size of our render, and we'll just be able to watch this animation as it currently is. We can go to our preview options if you want to change any of the different settings. But basically we're going to render and just go to make preview. And now we can see that it's just going to render out our hypervoxels and give us a nice preview of the scene, so we can see this a little bit better and how each of these different effects are applying to each other. So I'll let this finish out rendering the 500 frames, and then we can play it back and take a look at how our scene currently looks. And then we can go in and change some other options and take a look at expanding this effect a little bit more. And now we can take a look at our animation. And we can see each of the fireballs kind of falling to the ground and then exploding into kind of a smoky effect. And overall it looks really good. Of course, what we could also do is if we'd want some streaming smoke coming from our fireballs, we would also add another child emitter, which would not be connected to the end and just emitting directly from each of these particles. And that way we could add another hypervoxel effect, which is going to be the smoke. But we can end up some really neat looking effects this way. We could also simulate rain, so we could make each of these fireballs that we currently have a droplet of rain, and then when it hits the ground we could have smaller droplets of rain kind of bouncing off the surface. And that way you get a really realistic looking rain effect, creating some nice splashes and different overall effects that way. I'll go ahead and close this out, but you can really see how having these separate groups is really important for hypervoxels. and how we can modify our scene. So I'm going to go ahead and just remove the hypervoxels from our scene, and we're going to take a look at expanding upon what we currently have a little bit more and creating a much more realistic looking effect. Because let's say we wanted to have each one of these particles on the bottom breaking up into a new emitter, and then also have each one of those particles being its own emitter. So let's take a look at that right now. And what we can do is add in another particle object, and I'm going to call this emitter child collide, and we'll have this as an HV emitter. And I'm just going to close out our properties right now. I'm also going to switch to our perspective view so we can move around our scene a little bit easier without worrying about creating any sort of keyframes for our camera. And what I want to do is go to our motion options for this new emitter. You can hit the M on the keyboard to open that up, and the parent emitter is going to be emitter child. You can go ahead and close that out, and now open up the object properties, and I'm going to give this a new group, and I'm going to call this group underscore collide child, or child collide if you wanted to keep it along with the other ones. And now we can see we have 3 groups, and what I want to do is change our nozzle to parent emitter. And because these particles are part of their own group, they will not be affected by any of the collisions or the gravity within the scene. I'm going to increase our birth rate up to 200 and increase our particle limit up to 100,000. I also want to change our particle timeline up to 500 frames. And now we can scrub through and see that our new particles are generating along with the other ones. Of course, we do need to add a little bit of vibration, and I'm also going to reduce the birth rate down to 150 for now. Go to our motion option, and under vibration increase that to 0.5. Now keep in mind the way we have this set up with our collision and the way they're generated, we're going to have a lot of particles going down with that overall generating, and that's because that collision object is a little bit below, and that's one of the drawbacks to this method. And we can see that just going below the object, basically because if we take a look a little bit closer at one specific particle, it is being generated before they move upward. So we'll scroll through, and we can see that once it hits that emitter, it will start to generate, and they're all being thrust downward, and some of them start to come back up, and then they will continually generate our new particles. But of course we will still have some going down. And now if we fix the effect upward, it should look good enough, and even with those particles going below, it shouldn't present a problem. But what I want to do is first decrease our birth rate, and I'm also going to reduce the vibration a little because they're expanding a little bit too much, and we really don't have the trails that I'm looking to create. So we'll bring our birth rate down to 50. And now we can see each of those particles, and we're going to go into the motion and set our vibration down to 0.1 and really reduce that amount. And we can see that kind of continuing with the object, and they're not really following behind. and staying in place. And there's a couple of ways we can fix that. We can increase the particle resistance, and I'll bring that up to 5. And that will definitely fix the effect, and it will look a little bit better. So now we have these small little bursts of individual particles, and it looks a little more realistic and definitely much more complex. Of course, we still don't have the gravity that we would want on that second emitter. So what I can do is create a new emitter for that group, where we're just going to affect the parent emitter of the collision, and the one we're working on right now, to start bringing these particles down. But another thing to keep in mind is that gravity will really influence the bounce effect of that second collision, so we may have to adjust that amount as well. So we're going to select first that emitter child, and we can either create gravity directly within it, which might be effective enough to generate this effect. So we'll go to gravity, and I'm going to type in -1 on the Y, and we just want to see how much that really affects it. Okay, and it looks like -1 maybe is a little bit too much, so we're going to try -0.5, and we're just going to do half that amount. And now we can see a really nice looking gravity effect on those particles, where they're starting to kind of come down. And I'm going to go back to our child collide. So in this case, we didn't need to create a new gravity object, although we can create one for that group specifically if we wanted to create the same sort of effect. But since we're only really working with one emitter, just doing it on itself really works okay. And we're going to go to the motion for our newest emitter in the child collide. I'm going to increase our vibration up to 0.15 just to make it a little more dramatic, and have them spread out a little bit more. And maybe we'll bring that up to 0.2. And that does look a little bit better. And of course, we could always add in other wind effects if we wanted to add maybe a little bit of turbulence or have a little more gravity. And if this is going to be smoke, we might want to have the particles start to move upward. So what I can do is either create a new gravity object, or we can use the gravity option within this particle to make it start to travel upward as smoke would. I'm going to set that to 0.5 positive Y, and we can scrub through, and now we can see that a little bit better, and of course our smoke is traveling upward. Might be a little bit too much, and of course that also is not going to affect or be part of our resistance, and we might want to have a little bit of resistance on there, so we can go to the motion and use velocity to change that. So we go to 0 for our gravity, and now set the velocity to, let's go ahead and type in 0.3, because it looked like a gravity of 0.5 was too much. But now we can see, because of that velocity, it does change the effect of our particles and how they're emitted. So there's a lot of different ways we can play around with that to get different effects. Go back to the gravity, and I'm going to type in a value of 0.2 on the Y positive, and that'll just create a little bit of upward motion, but not affect the way our particles are created too much. And that way we still have motion after the particles sort of crash into that ground plane. What I also want to do is just decrease the particle generation a little bit more. So basically the birth rate, bring that down to 20. because if we're going to use this with hypervoxels, we certainly do not need this many particles in the scene. Okay, so now what we can do is calculate, and we can also tell that because our birth rate is so low, some of our particles are no longer creating the effect that we need. So that's another thing to keep in mind, is we're going to throw off that value a little bit, and that's because we have so many emitters connected to each other. But with that higher amount, it did look okay. So I'm going to hit Control to cancel that. And we may even need to increase our particle limit a little. And I'm going to bring that all the way up to 1,000,000. We can calculate that again. And we're still seeing the same sort of an effect happen, where they're not quite being generated at the same time. So we may need to play around with birth rates in order to get that to look correct, and have every single particle generating the amounts we need. And now we can see with the higher birth rate, it is working correctly. And now we can recalculate. And what we might want to do in this case is start to have these particles disappear after a certain amount of time. Because right now we're moving up into a really, really high particle range, and this is where we're going to start to see the fact that 1,000,000 particles might not be enough for the effect that we need. And that's when we can also start using different sections where we can set it by frame. We could also have it set to speed, so depending on the speed that it's at, it will generate a certain amount. And also setting to frame will generate the amount of particles over a certain amount of frames. And there's a lot we can do with it. But let's go back, and we're going to modify our first emitter, and we're going to create a little bit of an animation. One thing I do want to do is go in and change the birth rate of our first emitter to have less particles in there. But first we will need to modify our generator size, and I'm going to bring this down to 3 meters. And on our Y, I'll bring that back down to 0.5. And maybe I can decrease that generator size a little bit more, maybe to 1 meter. And that looks a little bit better. Something smaller. And now I want to create a little bit of motion. And basically this will simulate, maybe we have a plane flying over an area and dropping bombs. Something with motion where particles are kind of flying off of it. So let's start out by moving our first emitter over to the left. And now we want to go to our last frame. And this is going to take a little while to refresh because of all these particles that are being created. So one thing I do want to do before I start is go to our child collide, which has right now a little over 120,000 particles, which might be a little bit too much. And I'm going to decrease their lifetime, bring that down to 250, and that way we don't have that many particles in the scene. And you can see that has reduced it a little bit if we just refresh. And I could probably bring that down a little bit further, but this should be good for now. We can select our first object and first emitter that we're moving and animating, and I'm just going to pull this over to the right side of the screen, which is going to simulate, let's say we had a plane moving, and this would be something we would want to have maybe in the area where the bombs drop out of it. And we're going to go all the way back to the beginning of the animation, open up object properties, and just hit calculate. And we're going to go ahead and let that just finish out and calculate. and then we can take a look at the animation. And now we can go ahead and just close out the object properties and take a look at this, zooming in just a little bit more. And we can scrub through our animation and view all of our particles and different effects and see sort of the kind of effect if we had maybe an airplane dropping bombs or a similar sort of an effect. And now this is a very fast animation, and we might want to slow down the rate in which the first particles hit the ground. But we can do something really cool with it, as you can see. And how I was talking before about the second emitter that we have not constantly creating particles, by using the third emitter, and what we could do is decrease that resistance, maybe increase the vibration to have them spread out a little bit more. We can create this sort of an effect of a constant emitting surface. And then what we can do is use our hypervoxels that we were working on before and now add trails behind each of the objects, and we get some really cool looking emitters and effects. And we start to see that once we reach a certain area too, the particles do change their motion because of the resistance on the second emitter. And if we take a look, we can see that we have some very straight emissions from that second set, and that's caused by the resistance. So if we reduce the resistance so they continue, then we'll be able to have that curve effect throughout, but otherwise they are going to straighten out. But for the time frame we can see right now, we end up with a really interesting looking effect. And of course this is also 3 sets of emitters that can each have its own hypervoxel effect. And we don't really need to worry about those particons that are going below our object, because in most cases we wouldn't see those rendered in our scene. And also, because these are in different groups, always remember that we can set up different wind objects to affect each one of these particles. So if I wanted a little bit of turbulence on this last set of particles and just have them rotate around, whether with the vortex or any of the other shapes, even velocity, we can set it up for that specific group. And we can see the overall amount of detail if we zoom in a little bit more and see that just a little bit better. And that overall effect, it looks pretty cool. And next we're going to take a look at using these objects and the parent emitters a little bit more and create just kind of a simple scene to demonstrate the effect with even more emitters and also using the collisions. And what we're going to do is take one particle and expand it in kind of the same sort of way we just did, but it'll create some really interesting looking effects, and you'll be able to maybe understand how this is all working a little bit better.